very bright up here. So my name's Elise Kornack, as he just said. I'm coming to you guys from the Catskill Mountains. That's about 2.5 hours northwest of New York City. My wife and I moved there about 5 months ago after we closed our restaurant, Take Root. We closed the restaurant to move, and we were really excited about having a fresh start somewhere in nature. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about mental wellness, both personally, a little bit about my family, and then how that reflects in the industry. Before I begin talking, if you guys could all join me in just a big deep breath here. We're taking in a lot. A lot is coming in, so let's just take 1 second to let a little bit out. So just on your own, a little bit in and then a little bit out. I know that helped me, so. So that was something I learned to do a lot. Starting a first memory that I have of something that I want to share with you guys was last January. I was sitting on our terrace outside of our apartment, and I couldn't breathe. I was gasping for air. My chest was really tight. I couldn't swallow, and it felt like my heart was beating both fast and slow, if that's even possible. I asked myself over and over, is this my new reality? I had been feeling that exact way for about 3 months at the time, so it certainly felt like it was a possibility that it might be that way. About 3 months, this was at 3 months after my first panic attack, which was October of 2016, last year. This is actually the first time I'm really sharing this in any public fashion, so bear with me if it gets a little emotional. The day that I came back to my wife with these symptoms, I walked in the house and I told her how I was feeling, and without any hesitation, she said, okay, well, let's get you some cough medicine for your bronchitis, which so clearly you have, and some marijuana and maybe some Advil PM for the insomnia, and you'll shake it off and that's how it'll be. It didn't even occur to us to think that those symptoms would in any way be connected to any sort of mental instability or unwellness. Growing up, I was very unfamiliar with what anxiety felt like within my own body. My mother was diagnosed with a version of bipolar a couple years ago, though she suffered from that illness her and my entire life. She actually, ironically enough, used cooking as a coping mechanism. It helped calm her down, and this was something that she shared with me at a very young age. So this was something that was very passionate for both of us and connected us. And kind of the irony of the situation was that later on, the thing that brought us together was something that we were both going to end up struggling from. Prior to owning my own restaurant, I was obviously a line cook, and at that time, you're less inclined to address any emotional discomforts you may be enduring because, I was focused on, building my career and, building my reputation and doing a good job. But, in rare moments of solitude, I remember recalling some of the dark memories of my mother's illness and some of her manic episodes and wondered, would I ever feel that way? Was that something I would ever understand feeling? And then I would kind of then comfort myself with some of our fonder memories cooking together and the passion that we shared there. So throughout this talk, you're going to see some threads of both my mother's illness, cooking, and then also my own experience. Being in the kitchen felt right for me. It kept me emotionally aligned. The focus it required, kept me feeling really on a high. I loved the thrill of the service, of being in the weeds, of the late nights, and I really fell in love with it early on. Working in someone else's restaurant, there's not as much at risk. Not as much reputational risk, not as much financial risk, not as much stake in the game, to say the least. Of course, you need to show up and do a good job, but that felt like a given to me. I met my wife a couple years into being in the industry, and at the time my mother's illness was kind of rearing its ugly head. Her mood swings were much more dramatic, and she was becoming a burden to herself as she was constantly thinking of taking her own life. This became very overwhelming to me to kind of understand what she was feeling. And I've come to find that mental illness, whether it be temporary or permanent, diagnosed or not, it seems to be a terribly confusing and really awkward topic for most people to talk about. No one really knows what it is or how to define it. And in the restaurant industry, we're prone to push through these feelings of stress and exhaustion and not really fully understanding the possible repercussions to our body, whether that be mentally or physically. In 2013, my wife and I moved to Brooklyn to open Take Root. We were totally naive to the unique challenges we were going to endure as new restaurant owners, or anything that we were going to be up against. And I was learning at that time to kind of balance the needs of my mother's illness and my own life. But I was becoming increasingly more distant to the idea that I would ever feel the way she did or understand how she was experiencing on a day-to-day basis. I was happy, I was ambitious, I had my new restaurant, I was enthusiastic and eager to please my diners, and that was really not on my mind. About 8 months into opening Take Root, a critic from the New York Times came in and to review the restaurant. I was 25 years old. Mind you, we had 12 seats on a very sleepy block in Brooklyn. I always had ambitions of, earning stars and getting recognition and features, but I never thought it was going to be my first restaurant, and most certainly not in a 500 square foot one with 12 seats. So you can probably understand that changed things a little bit for me. And the glowing review really made a huge difference in what was going to come next. Over the next 2 years, I became really keen to understanding how easy it was going to be for people to come in and critique us, my food, how we ran the restaurant, especially with social media. And instead of being afraid of that feeling, my naivety and my innocent confidence drove me to push even harder. I became obsessed with reading other restaurants' reviews, seeing where I stacked up against my fellow peers. And the cooking of the food ended up becoming very slowly a means to an end. I was more driven about the recognition and the success than I was about kind of what I was creating. Simultaneously, as I was so driven to do what I was doing and was totally unaware of what that was going to mean for me mentally and physically later on, my mom was getting more sick, and simultaneously she was really struggling. I called her one afternoon to see how she was doing, and she said, I couldn't get out of bed, I can't do anything, and she was hysterical, and I said, well, why don't you go cook? Totally vaguely thinking, oh, that'll make you feel better still, won't it? And she said she was completely disinterested, and that all she wanted to do was wake up and feel like she understood her own body and mind. A feeling I came scarily close to understanding last winter. Fast forward, we're a few days before that panic attack I referenced earlier. I was laying on my back on the floor of our wine room at the restaurant, and there was a fan above me, and I just watched it kind of wobble and whirl. And, I felt sick to my stomach with nerves. I felt exhausted and emotionally empty. I'd pushed myself so hard that I felt disconnected to the craft and more nervous than I'd ever felt, and for no reason. There was no critic coming in. There was no one deemed important. It was just a regular night of service. I was so completely convinced that any mental instability was considered an illness and that I would be able to recognize those signs of my mother's condition. But in reality, I couldn't even recognize it in myself. I was convinced that on a day off, I'd get some sleep and I'd come back and I'd feel better. Obviously, I wouldn't be here today talking about this if that was the case. I did not get better. In fact, I got much worse. And the kicker here was that I was ashamed to reach out for any help, ashamed to talk to my family, in fear that they would judge me and think that I was going to become sick like my mother and a burden on them. I was afraid to talk to anybody in the industry because I thought they would think I was weak, especially being a woman and a gay one at that. So I pushed myself even further, right into a complete nervous breakdown. With Michelin star and James Beard nominations 3 years running, countless awards and acknowledgments and recognition for my work, why was it that I was feeling so unfulfilled and so broken was beyond me at the time. I did everything to bury this feeling and talk to no one except for my wife. 4 years now into owning the restaurant is where we're at in this story, and I thought, okay, at least we're in the clear. There's no more reviews coming in. No one's going to really care about what we're up to, so I can kind of coast. Well, that wasn't the case. I really still to this day don't know why this happened, but someone from the New Yorker decided to come in 4 years after opening and write a review. At this time, I was really physically unwell, and I was in no condition to perform. And I was still processing my mother's illness. At the time, she was trying to take her own life, and I was not sleeping because of my own instability. So it seemed like maybe a time to step back, but instead I pushed through. Push through became this go-to phrase for my wife and I, always saying to each other, just push through, walk through this tunnel, and kind of gripping to the fantasy that at the end of it, we'd be blasted by some light, and we'd look back on these tear-filled nights that we endured and kind of think, okay, well, at least we made it through. It seemed impossible. The New Yorker review came out. It was wonderful. Our guests were happy. We were 2 months from actually signing on our house and leaving the city. So at this time, I should have been able to kind of relax and be confident that things were going to be okay. But because I had ignored all of the signs in the years previous, I was actually in the worst situation that I could ever be in. I started to feel shame for my food, totally disconnected to the craft, and I was fueled by negativity, resentment, and judgment. I recalled the story Like Water for Chocolate. I'm not sure how many of you guys remember the movie or the book, but the main plot is that Tita, the main character, her intense emotions start to seep into her food. When she felt sad, her diners got sick. When she felt passionate, they felt lustful. So I was convinced that everything anyone was tasting was disgusting and that they would also leave feeling just as terribly as I was while I was cooking the food. Often the most important thing we can do is to come to terms with anxiety and the stress. These feelings are a part of human nature. They're a part of our innate survival mechanisms. They cannot be suppressed. to do so is only going to manifest into physical illness. Most commonly we feel stressed, we want to be alone. I can totally recognize and understand that sentiment. But it wasn't really until I found someone to talk to that I was able to work through those map of my emotions, kind of see where the roads crossed, maybe where I should have stopped versus sped on, looked at all the possible routes to get to the same destination. Okay, that sounds super trite. I know we've all heard it before, but it's really helpful. And this is the remedy for this problem was really simple. It wasn't terribly time-consuming and relatively attainable, as long as I told myself one thing, that taking care of my body and mind were not options anymore, but they were necessities. So by the time we closed the restaurant, I had a better understanding of what I want my next place to look like. So that's what I'm going to share with you before I finish up here. So I have 3 things. The first 2 are kind of things I'm going to implement, and the last one is a proposition for everyone here and all the chefs who are listening in. So the first one is talk therapy, and it being available to everybody in the restaurant, whether that be front of house or back of house. You don't have to be crazy or be sick or be sad to need to talk to somebody. It's just a way to release what's on your mind, what's on your chest, not to your partner, your spouse, or to a coworker, but to somebody who's totally unbiased. I don't know what that's going to look like, whether it be once a month or once a week, but I want it to be paid for by my restaurant. I don't want the line cooks and chefs to have to go spend their hard-earned money on something that's actually quite expensive, even with insurance, and take their time off on their days off to go do that when they should be with their friends and their family and doing things that are stimulating. The second is being mandatory outside activity. Now, this is not foraging for the restaurant, looking for mushrooms, or talking while you walk in the woods or sharing a beer. This is something actually that's called forest bathing. I just recently came across the term, and I didn't realize what I was doing all along was actually that. And what this is it's when you go into the woods void of conversation, void of noise, void of music or earphones, and you actually touch, smell, and listen to everything that you're doing. So this could be eavesdropping on a chipmunk, or watching a worm crawl over a stick or a leaf fall, but really paying attention to that exact thing that is happening for no other reason except for that. What this does, obviously, is it heightens senses, relaxes the mind, and of course it stretches your muscles, and you can breathe some fresh air. This is essentially a walking meditation, but you're also kind of absorbing the inspiration without thinking about it, how it's going to become a dish or an element in a cuisine. And the last thing is the proposition, and that is that I'd like to kind of encourage chefs to look beyond cities for restaurants, to push the boundaries of where to open an establishment and recognize the changing power that a good restaurant can and does have on a community. In New York City alone, like 30 to 50 restaurants open every season, and the media covers them, and about all of them are in the New York metropolitan area. Meanwhile, a lot of people live in the rural communities outside of there. A lot of those people need jobs, and more importantly than that, not all chefs thrive in an urban environment. The reality is that the recent arrivals of restaurants and hotels and bars in the community that I live in, which is a rural community outside of the city, have dramatically changed those communities economically, socially, and more importantly, it's given opportunities for chefs that might not do so well mentally and physically in an urban environment to still build their reputation. I was not presented with that opportunity when I was a young cook. The only way to build your reputation is to move to a city and to work for a chef that has, is notable, that has a good resume themselves. There aren't those kinds of restaurants in America that are in the country. They're all in cosmopolitan urban areas. And we, as ambitious chefs with a platform, need to open them outside of those places, in nature, in quiet, and give, a better quality of life to some staff. Perhaps that intensity of the city is not what makes us tough, but perhaps it's what breaks some of us down. Perhaps more options where young cooks can build a reputation would make for a more diverse kind of cook, a more diverse kind of industry, and a healthier one at that. There's countless ways for us to approach this topic of mental wellness, countless methods to heal people who have felt unwell to any degree, whether it be temporary or permanent, treated or untreated. But the thing we need to be most diligent about is providing resources and reminding ourselves and anyone we know who's struggling from it that, it's nothing to be ashamed of. And untreated, it will only become worse and will not disappear on its own. So before I hand over the mic back to JP and the next person, let's just do one more deep breath. So we're just gonna go in and then back out. You guys can do that a few more times throughout, other people talking too, without my instruction. Thank you guys so much for listening today.